This is the Coquitlam River watershed wetland where you have Mackin Park situated. The areas outlined in the thin black lines are areas of riparian zone assessment and management, and the dark green are the wetlands around Nelson Creek. The area of observation was right next to Mill Creek Village in a section of Nelson Creek that measured roughly 2.2 meters across. Now, the purpose of this project is to observe the drainage of large fields such as this and the effects that they have on the discharge of small urban creeks with impermeable surfaces and flat little vegetation. So the first immediate evidence that we see for urban runoff are these pipes and culverts that drain into Nelson Creek and the surrounding tributaries. These culverts are less intrusive than these pipes, but they do present a barrier to any migrating fish that are trying to get up the creek, wherein some might get through and some might not. In this picture, you can see that the runoff coming out of this culvert is quite fierce, which could also damage the fish physically if it were to fall through. These other smaller white pipes drain directly into the area which I observed and measured. The amount of water coming through these smaller white pipes was dramatically larger than when it was dry. It was barely a trickle when it was dry, and it was almost shooting out of the pipe when it was raining. Now, these are drainage pipes, or where they drain from a collecting basin and drain directly into the creek. This process shoots a lot larger quantity of water into the creek at a lot faster rate than what would naturally occur if the creek were to fill up with groundwater and the rainwater permeating into the banks of the creek slowly from the groundwater reserves. Now, as can be seen through these pictures, the piping around the Nelson Creek area does not limit itself to one or two small culverts. It in fact runs all throughout the field and the communal areas and drains directly into the creek through these small white pipes. Now, the water runoff directly from the road comes down the large culverts that I mentioned before. When I was down there by the creek and taking my measurements for the water, I was also making observations on the quality of the riparian zones, which measured about 5 meters across. Now, their general morphology for the ground and structure was quite good. However, the vegetation that grew along the stream banks was mostly 2-meter shrubs that didn't really provide much shade to the water to allow it to stay at a cool level for the salmon that were hatching in that area. Now, the stream temperature averaged between 10 to 12 degrees Celsius on both a cold and warm day, which means that the fluctuation itself wasn't very large. However, shaded areas were few and far between for stretches of the creek that had a larger width. Now, the width of the creek did change between periods of rain and no rain by almost 30 centimeters. During the rainy periods of about 36 hours, the creek increased in a discharge rate of about 6.5 times. So the discharge rate of the creek with no water for about 2 days was 0.0119 meters cubed per second. After about 36 hours of straight rain, the discharge rate increased to 0.0783 meters cubed per second, as we can see in these two graphs. Now, while these graphs may seem insignificant in their current value. They actually signify a massive output of urban runoff that accumulates on the impermeable surfaces of the surrounding area. Mill Creek Village, which is a residential area about 20 meters to the right of the park, is mostly pavement, which accumulates massive amounts of water, dumping it all into the creek in one large runoff. To the left of the creek is a large field, which, while does absorb some water in the ground and in the grass, is not nearly as much of a sponge for this area of wetland as the trees and other vegetation would be had they not been cut down. An engineering group called CH2M Hill created the Nelson Creek Integrated Watershed Management Plan. Now, this is what their plan states. Now, the engineering group gave the Nelson Creek a poor rating in terms of ecological sustainability and biological health. Now, they outlined three major problems with this creek in their assessment of the watershed health. Among them were poor riparian health and fish habitat, poor water quality with elevated levels of fecal chloroform, heavy metals, and plastics, and increasing erosion of the banks. Now, for the water quality, that has to do with urban runoff and chemicals that are coming out of sewage with poor drainage and or running off of the pavement with increased motor vehicle traffic. And the bank erosion has to do with the straightening and alteration of the riparian zones, where water level has actually increased, as has the flow rate. So with increased flow velocity, you get more bank erosion. What they've done is they have sheltered some of the banks by creating blockades, or they have helped support the banks with extra rocks or nets. And what these do is stop the natural process of the creek meandering or making its own bends around certain corners. Now, while this is a short-term solution, what it does is confine the creek to a very specific shape. Now, this shape could be beneficial to some organisms, but it could also be very detrimental to others. Now, a solution that could perhaps mitigate some of these problems of confining the river to a specific shape would be, instead of creating stoppages for the erosion of the banks directly on the banks of the river at the water level, you could in fact put impermeable and non-eroding blockades on each side of the creek on the boundaries that you want to keep the water inside of. These could act as a type of bedrock where the creek could not expand or meander outside of these certain constraints. That way you could keep the natural process of the creek creating bends and corners while simultaneously almost controlling the direction which the creek flows. Now, concerning the water quality, there's not much to do besides set up filtration plants and ensure that the drainage systems and pavement runoff is as clean as possible before entering the water system. Now, considering riparian zones, the largest impact that I saw when I was down at the creek were the small riparian zones of almost 5 to 6 meters and the overwhelming presence of invasive species. Probably the most dominant was the European blackberry, which was all along the riparian zones. Now, these outcompete the natural vegetation that would be living in this area and create an almost monoculture for any of the organisms that require the bank as their living positions. Now, while all these problems are quite pressing, the engineering group highlighted one problem that stands above the rest, and that is the incredibly quick erosion that's happening on the banks of the Nelson Creek. Now, this comes with the measurements that I performed on the creek. With increased flow rate comes increased velocity of the stream. Now, increased velocity has more potential to wipe away larger sediment sizes and dig away at corners and bends in the stream. Now, this translates directly to more erosion. So larger particles get washed down the stream, you get a wider stream, you get more water coming in, and it plays back into itself as a positive feedback loop. Now, these bank stabilizations and bank blankets that they've put up on the sides of the creek are a temporary fix. They are made of plastic, which means that they are, while small, still a pollutant to the water. And as I said before, they stop the meandering of the creek. Now, what can we do to prevent the creek from eroding to a dangerous level where it affects human activities, while still allowing the creek to perform its natural ecological functions? Well, touched upon before was the concept of banks in the on the outside boundaries of where the creek should be allowed to flow, made of hard, impermeable substances such as a pavement or a tough concrete or some type of igneous rock. Now, these could act as a type of bedrock which stops the creek from expanding past a certain point. But what it does allow is for the creek to shift and make turns and corners within these boundaries, giving it a sort of natural morphology that would otherwise be compromised if humans tried to stabilize the banks and forced it into a certain position. Now, this would allow the creek to filter out the water it needs at the right velocity while not increasing the chance of mudslides and bank erosions at a large level. Sunken boundaries outside of the banks of the immediate Nelson Creek are one way that we could help establish a boundary for a meandering river. However, a secondary, more natural approach could be to reestablish the native bank stabilizing vegetation that has been outcompeted by the invasive blackberry species. So if you were to reestablish this vegetation that in a healthy ecosystem would be naturally stabilizing the banks and slowing down the process of erosion, you could minimize the amount of human need to protect and stop the river from expanding, or the creek from expanding. So while both these procedures to mitigate the impacts of fast-moving water eroding the banks are viable for Nelson Creek, perhaps one of the best solutions would be to avoid the problem altogether. This is the approach that the Washington government has undertaken when they put forth the legislation of HPAs, otherwise known as hydraulic project approvals. Now, these are documents that anyone who wants to build or alter the riparian zone of a waterway has to get signed by the mayor or the organization in charge of those waterways that allows them to undergo this construction. Now, it doesn't have to be construction per se, but it is any process or anything that a person wants to do that alters or could alter the riparian zone or water habitat. This includes building docks, bridges for fishing zones, practically any removal of organic matter such as fallen logs or a large-scale removal of leaves that have fallen into the creek or ocean or lake. Now, this is a way of preventing problems from occurring before they occur to a point where they can't be easily fixed. Regardless of the preventative conservation techniques used to help the riparian zones of Nelson Creek, the continued health and development of these areas in a natural and environmentally friendly way is of top priority and needs to have more energy put into it and more attention given to it by both the surrounding population and the organizations in charge of this area.